So we're going to start with the discussion about STOL. This is not a formal presentation, but we want to learn from Doug and Steve that flew their STOL plane in here and competed in some STOL competitions in Alaska or wherever you have gone. We appreciate Oshkosh, okay. But we appreciate you sharing thoughts and notions on there, because I was telling some of them this morning that, you know, some of the things that I was taught, I've learned it was wrong, especially for short, soft fields. And I've been flying this tail wheel for about 4 years, and thankfully people corrected me and said, hey, you're doing this wrong. And after 4 years, I finally feel somewhat proficient. So the goal here is to share the knowledge in the group here and from you for your experience with STOL, so we can improve the proficiency of tailwheel airplane pilots, as particularly the Stinson pilots. So this is again kind of a discussion, but we want to share some questions, and I want to. Maybe you can share your experience of how you got started in the STOL, and he's going to record this back here so other people can.
Well,
you can sit or talk.
Okay, well, I better sit. I guess I don't know really how I got started. I was always, my airplane's unique, and it has some automatic leading edge slats like the Helio Courier and stuff. And the guy that got me started in aviation had been a missionary pilot in the Philippines, and they flew Helio Couriers back in the day there. And with the plane being manufactured in Kansas, why that was just, I was always interested in that. And so in the early 90s, the plans got offered for this airplane that I fly, a Pegasus Air, and so I thought, well, if I want one like that, I guess I'll build it. So I built that. As a side note, I was at the Dayton Air Museum once, and I had heard that one of the Stinsons, and I believe it's an A1 that the Stinson made early leading up into World War II, that was kind of the U.S.'s answer for the Storch. And so I walked all around looking for that, and finally found it hanging up about 100 feet in the rafters, and didn't get to see it much. So, but it was an airplane that Stinson built as a prototype for the Army, Army Air Corps, that had the automatic leading edge slats, and it was a lot like the Storch, and the fact that the sides sloped in so that you could look out and observe and some of that kind of stuff. So, but I can't tell you much more than that because, well, it was 100 feet in the air. So the airplane just led itself towards STOL operations and stuff. So as you guys probably saw, it's kind of a small airplane. It's got full span flapper-ons, and I've got 180 horse on it. So that gives it some pretty good power and takeoff and stuff. So I don't know, early on in the Oshkosh, I had competed around at some of the fly-ins for the Super Cub guys did and everything like that. And so early on when the Frank Knapp, the guy with the little stripped down, almost an airplane that flies in the STOL competition up there, and in Alaska, he called me up and asked me if I'd participate in that up there and stuff. And so I suppose flying up there was one of the biggest thrills you get, you know, because where else do you get to go and not only fly in front of all those people at Oshkosh, but when they originally did it out on the main runway before they moved it to the ultralight field, why, then you had to attend the briefing every day with all the other people, like, oh yeah, Sean Tucker and all those people, and and so that was a big thrill to me, you know. And I always went up there just with the idea of doing the best I could and not breaking the airplane, you know. So I never pushed the limits like I might at some little get together or anything like that. I just tried to do good, clean takeoffs and stuff. I'm not a very good person either for giving you STOL techniques, because, you know, every airplane's unique and different. And so what works for my airplane for STOL doesn't probably work for yours. I've done a fair amount of off-airport work with the airplane, flown it to Alaska 5 times, and then fly around here and stuff. And the guy that got me started, or somebody along that era, really told me the best deal about it, you know. So in off-airport landing, you can call it STOL or whatever you want. It's really about knowing your airplane, and, you know, takeoff. It doesn't make any difference what you can take off in, whether you can take off in 75 feet or 575 feet. If you don't know that, if you don't know your airplane, and if you can't look out there or step it off and say, yeah, I can make that, so it's not any good, right? And the same way with landing, whatever distance you can land in, whether that be 50 feet or 500 feet, one of the biggest things is to pick that 500 feet. In other words, it's no good if you think I can land it in 500 feet and you float down the runway 100 feet, well, you're 100 feet out. I mean, or you missed your landing area by 100 feet, and up in Alaska on the gravel bars and stuff, that didn't work. In other words, and when you get, and you guys know this, but you get places where they use airplanes, and it's not all STOL airplanes. I mean, they use Stinsons, they use Cessnas, they use Cessna tricycle gears up there. I landed at just a little boulder pile beside the Alcan Highway at Blanchot Lake, and I thought, wow, this is a pretty rough strip, and I'm on 31-inch tires, and a guy comes in there in a 172 and lands. I thought, well, I'm not so much, am I? So as far as techniques, I can't tell you, I have 2 or 3 different techniques I use for the STOL takeoff on mine, and a lot of it's on how I feel at the time. The safest, I have really big flaps, and the safest for me to do it consistently is pull the flaps on, raise the tail as soon as I can, and when I get to airspeed, I rotate. That's not the quickest takeoff. The quickest takeoff is to accelerate tail low, pick the tail up just a little bit and pull the flaps on at the same time. But the problem with that second technique is that if I'm a couple mile an hour slow, then it adds a considerable distance to the takeoff. In other words, if I don't hit it just right, so I don't know. I wished I knew more to add to you guys. I can't. I've done a little instruction here lately. I'm not an instructor in our flying club's Cub, and it really taught me something. A couple things. One is that there are people that are instructors and teachers, and then I'm not. Because I've got a few thousand hours in tail draggers, and so somebody'd say, well, why are you doing this? And I'm like, well, I didn't even realize I was doing it, because I just flown a long time, and you forget why you learn. And so that was kind of a good experience for me, because I had to go back and think about it, and think about, okay, why do I do this, or whatever, and this is not necessarily Stinson, but it's all airplanes, I mean, I'm really after them. The Cub is a really rudder airplane, and I don't know, the Stinson's probably not so much, but so I'm really after them. Keep that ball centered, and it's like, why? Well, and I think about it, and it's like, well, listen, so they make a skidding turn, say base to final, and the ball skids to the outside. Well, the reason you got to listen, because the airplane stalls away from the ball. So if you're in a 30 or 45 degree bank and it stalls with a skid, and then they're like, well, you showed me a slip and the ball was way off, and it's like, no, the ball was the other way. And so when it stalled in a slip, it walked back level. The wings want to go back level and gives you more time to react. And so things like that are things that I relearned. I mean, I knew it. I knew I wanted to keep the ball centered, but in too many years, I forgot exactly why. And I guess I didn't totally forgot. I just had to think like, okay, so I've always been an admirer of the Stinson, and Steve and I were both just looking, thinking, wow, we would have liked to have heard the care and feed of the Franklin engine, just because, been loosely following the Franklin engine over the decades and watching it, and keep hoping somebody comes back and moves it back into production. So I don't know. I guess if you guys got any questions to ask me, I'll try and answer them, but I don't know. I suspicion there's a lot of pilots here that are better tailwheel pilots than I am, because, well, I've always looked at myself as kind of like, well, I get it done, but I don't know if I get it done great or not. So
one of the questions we was talking about, I'm sorry, at lunch was, why in some of the STOL competitions do the guys hold the brakes and put the tail down?
They're trying to get to where they can accelerate the absolute fastest. And the way to do that is the least amount of drag, and so, and you'll see a few guys do the tail low takeoff, but, they've got a lot of horsepower and they can accelerate fast, and then the Cubs are really light on the tail anyway. You can, if you don't have anything in the back seat of a Super Cub or anything, especially one of the ones that's got the 0360s on them, well, then they're nose heavy. And so you can stand it on its nose easy, but that lets them just accelerate fast by having that tail up and accelerate fast. And it also maybe a little bit like my way of doing it when I told you that this pulling the flaps on and accelerate that's my safest way. You know, in other words, when I say safest, that's the way I can demonstrate a pretty good takeoff without having a lot of problems. When you get to watching the guys that are really doing the stall competitions, there are just a lot of techniques. If you guys get a chance sometime, go back and listen to one of the Oshkosh videos, and there's a guy there, I think he was there in 14, by the name of Jerry Burr in a little PA-11. And just watch the elevator and the tail and the rudder when Jerry goes to take off, when he flies that airplane. He takes that 100 horsepower PA-11 and is right there with the best of them in the bigger engines. And you watch him, he moves the elevator back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like he's trying to swim it like a porpoise or something. I don't know. I look at that and think, wow, what? But the guy's good, you know, and he does a great job. So anyway, and those airplanes are light on the tail, and it's just a way to get as streamlined as possible, the less resistance they got, you know, so they accelerate and take off.
How's an automatic leading edge slat work?
So the automatic leading edge slat, of course, has the same purpose as you guys as slots. You know what I mean? When it's deployed, there's no different. In your case, the slots are out there to keep the outside portion of the wing flying when the inside stalls and keep your aileron working. So what happened with the leading edge slats, you know, and of course the people that I think originally invented them was a British company in the 30s called Hanlon Page. And so the way these work is the slat is on a set of rollers, and there's 4 of them, 2 on each wing. There's no interconnections to the slats, but each end of the same slat has an interconnection. So you can't pull the slat out crooked, like say grabbing one side of a large dresser drawer. It's got an interconnect on the back side with a torque tube back there that when you pull one side, the other side goes out. And that just pull one side of one slat, and the other side of that same slat goes out. So when you're in a high angle of attack, if you watch, I've looked at some videos or pictures of showing them toughen a wing where they'll take a wire hoop and go down about your jury strut and come around and then put yarn tufts on that. And it's just amazing how far below the wing and how far behind the leading edge that air is going up and over the leading edge. So on the leading edge slat, you got a higher pressure underneath and a low air pressure on top. And so when your angle of attack increases, and it's strictly related on angle of attack as far as the deployment of them, and that air gets out behind the slat and just pushes it out. And then when it does, why it's deployed. I've reached out my window after the slat's deployed, say at 50 mile an hour, and tried to reach out there and wiggle it, and it might just as well be bolted with bolt. It's just solid as can be. You'd think, oh well, no big deal, you know what I mean? But no, they deploy with a tremendous amount of force, and they stay out with a tremendous amount of force, you know. So and like I said, only this is doing it on the whole wing now, and so it makes the airplane fly really slow, you know, down to 30 mile an hour or so, you know. It also makes it really hard to spin. I can go up and demonstrate a 35 mile an hour turn to where I give it full aileron one way and full stick the other, and it just flat and just skids around the sky. And it's just like, wow, that shouldn't do it.
Get up enough speed, they automatically come back down?
Yeah, same thing. They automatically come back in. They come back in slower, so if they come out at, say, 50 or 60 mile an hour, then they go back in, and they'll creep back in a little bit, and they'll creep out, too, as long as there's not wind shear or turbulence. And they'll go back in at 70 and 80, so it takes more to go back in. One of the things that differ in my airplane than some of them, and the Helio Courier's one of them, is that the designer of my airplane has you put a little bumper and there's a little 16th inch gap always. It never completely closes. And that lets that air get started underneath there and makes a smooth deployment. You always hear people talk about the scariness of one slap deploying and another. These come out with so much force, and it's designed to come out well before the wing's going to stall. If it came right out right before the wing stalled, then you'd have a real problem with one of them. Yeah, but these don't. These come out 20 mile an hour before the wing stalls. So,
So how's that, is that calibrated springs or?
no springs at all. It's strictly that air pressure. In other words, when you're flying and they're at a cruise angle of attack, why there's all this pressure on the leading edge, right? But as you slow down and get the nose up in the air, you know, a typical airfoil stalls at 12, 14, 11 degrees angle of attack. You know, not deck angle, but angle of attack, you know, there. And with the leading edge slats, that can be doubled. So, but the other thing of it is so while that adds a lot to how slow it'll fly, adds a tremendous drag. So when it's in that position like that, the airplane's really draggy, and then with the full span flaperons, it becomes a horrendous rudder airplane. You know, I mean, lots of old airplanes are noted as a rudder airplane. You know, you get some guy that flows a Cherokee or a 172, and you know his feet doesn't do very much. And I suspicion the Stinson's more like mine, that you've got to coordinate. But I'm telling you, when I get slowed down anywhere below the 60 mile an hour mark, it's a lot of rudder. And when I get down to that below 40 mile an hour mark, it is a lot of rudder. So different. It's a different airplane. I don't know, and I don't want to dwell on that too much, just because it's a Stinson get together. And I will say this is. I'll be real surprised if there's any Pegasus Airs around 65 years later, and I see quite a few 65-year-old Stinsons here, so that's a real testament to the airplane.
Now, how fast is your airplane cruise?
So the cruise in my airplane's about 115 mile an hour at 2,400 RPM, so it's not really pushing it, you know, I mean, as far as the RPM's concerned.
So it took a while to get to Alaska.
Yeah, it takes a little while to get to Alaska. I don't know that. What's the Stinson cruise at?
Well, the book says 120, but I always figure 100.
Okay, so it's not very much different. You know, I can talk a lot more about Alaska because that's just a passion of mine. I tell everybody I'm a wannabe. In other words, I'm not an Alaskan. I've been up there, I don't know, 15 times, 5 times with this airplane, and other times we're flying up commercially and stuff. And it's a gorgeous trip that everybody should do, and the Stinson would be just a fantastic airplane for it. You know, you're not flying in and out of little strips unless you choose to go some of the backcountry stuff. You're flying just from airport to airport. You don't have to get high. The highest pass along the Alcan Highway is, I don't know, 4,100 feet. You don't need a tremendous range. The longest leg you need to make is from Whitehorse to Tok, Alaska, and that's about 340 statute miles. So there is some ways to get fuel, say at Beaver Creek or back at Haines Junction, but they're you have to call and make some arrangements or do it, kind of hunt it out. So that's your longest leg. And then the other thing of it is you're flying an airplane in the Stinson that's great for observing and great for flying low and enjoying things. I'll get guys tell me they're going to fly, I don't care, their Lancer to Alaska. And I said, well, it's a great airplane, but it's a lousy airplane to fly to Alaska. And they're like, why? And I says, goes too fast and goes too far in between things. You know, the real fun part of Alaska is once you get going to Alaska is for me anyways, once you get past Edmonton. And those guys are flying an airplane that's fast enough and got long enough legs that they make one stop between Edmonton and Alaska. And it's like, well, you missed out on all the fun. You know, I met all the people along the way at all these little airports, or spent the night, or got stuck because of weather, and I don't know. That's just a gorgeous trip. I never get into Canada and get away from a big center, big area, big city, that I'm not just horrendously taken back by the hospitality. They are just like people were when I was a kid growing up in small town Kansas. You know, got a courtesy car? No, but take my pickup over there. Or, well, I'm going to town anyway to eat and buy your lunch, or fight you to buy your lunch and stuff. They're just really nice people. The last trip up there, I got stuck in British Columbia for 3 days because of weather, and I had met some people at a little gathering like this several years before. Called them up and come out and picked me up and put me up for 3 days. I mean, I didn't hardly know them, and it just happens that way all the time. And so anyway, you know, everybody always talks about wanting to fly to Alaska, and do it. It is a great trip, great time, and it'll be a highlight of your flying career for most people.
Even in a 182.
Even in a 182, yeah.
Is there MoGas up there?
Not a lot of MoGas available. Matter of fact, I've never been in a place in Canada that had MoGas available, and Alaska, generally speaking, at the places that have gas, no. So you're worried about that because of the lower horsepower Stinsons probably don't like the 100. Yeah, the 150s. Yeah, the 165 too. What's the compression ratio on the 165? 7 to 1. So yeah, it's the same as the low horsepower Lycoming. So yeah. So I used to have an 0320 low horsepower or low compression 7 to 1 compression in this, and yeah, by the time you got home from Alaska, the plugs were telling you that they were ready to be cleaned or changed. So great trip.
How long did it take you?
Well, I use what I hope for when I go is if I get reasonable weather, and I've never been, but what I'm not stuck, at least coming or going one way or the other. You know, I've been stuck both ways, and I have to qualify that. I love to hunt. My trips up there are always to hunt, and so I'm going up there basically early September and coming home into September. Those are lousy. That's a lousy time. My little saying is that people say Alaska doesn't have 4 seasons. It's either summer or winter. And that's not true. There are 4 seasons, but spring and fall only last 2 weeks each, and you never know which 2 weeks those are going to be. So I fly up there in 30 hours. You know, it's about 2,800 miles from, I live in Emporia, just north of here, and it's about 2,800 miles into Fairbanks, okay? And so that usually works out to 30 hours, give or take a little bit of flying. And Fairbanks is a great place to headquarter out of if you fly up there. It's an international airport, but it's only Class D airspace. And they're used to guys like me that don't know anything. You know, they've got a terminal radar, what do they call it, ARSA, where you can contact quite a ways out and they'll guide you in. And there's a lot of military airspace in Alaska, and especially right up around Fairbanks. And so when I contact them, I always tell them that I'm unfamiliar with the area or the procedure. And I think by the time the controller gets me landed, he's thinking, no joke. But at Fairbanks, there's a campground right on the end of Fairbanks is like several different airports. They've got about a 9,000-foot runway for the big jets coming in, and some commercial airplanes. Everett Air flies C-46, not a C-47, C-46s and DC-5s or 6s in and out of there all the time. And then where else do you get to go and hear 4 radial engines taking off all the time? And they use it freighting stuff out into the villages and stuff around Alaska. So then beside that, they've got a 5,000-foot paved runway, a lot of the little commuter airlines and taxi deals, and a guy with his Mooney and Bonanza use. And then where that ends, right on the end of that, they've got a 2,500-foot gravel strip that they call the ski plane strip. And then off to one side, kind of between the two of those, they got what they call the float plane ditch. And at the end of the ski plane strip is a campground. It's got shower, it's got shelter houses, it's got wood. You know, they've got little barrel stoves there, and they've got wood split and bicycles to get on right around the airport if you want to go. So, I mean, that makes it a great place to headquarter and come in and out of. And then, you know, you can see that puts you a few hours flight from Denali. And if you want to go, one of my big deals I've always wanted to do and never made it because I've always stuck with weather and stuff is I always wanted to fly my airplane north of the Arctic Circle. And so north of Fairbanks, about 175 miles, is a little town that's, or at least an airfield, that's a step-off point for the Gates of the Arctic National Park called Badels. And I've always say, okay, at the end of this trip, I'm going to Badels, and then next thing you know, the weather looks bad, or I've been gone too many days or weeks from home, and I don't make it. So, but anyway, if you wanted to, that's a great place. Don't be wrong, you can go down to Anchorage, and there's plenty of places, airports to fly on down there in Anchorage, and there's plenty of stuff to see down there and stuff. But I kind of like the Fairbanks area just because it's a little easier for a pasture flyer like me.
Something that's kind of new to me in soft takeoff is the notion of taking off without flaps, accelerating without flaps, getting to 60 miles an hour or so, and then pulling on the first notch of flaps is what I've been taught so far. But that's very common for your kind of flying.
Yeah, you know, I a lot of times will just accelerate in a 3-point attitude, and just about the time I got enough speed to where the tail would come up, I just pull the flaps and fly.
Okay.
You know, I mean, so that's pretty common.
Yeah.
And then soft field techniques, I'm not a good guy to answer because I put my first set of bush wheels on, I don't know, close to 15 years ago. And so that changes soft fields. And
It's all relative to the side of the tire, huh?
it is, you know. One of the things, and right now I have a couple of different tail wheels. Right now I got a great big tail wheel on there too, because one of the things you figure out when you start landing on those gravel bars, and some of them are gravel and some of them are really big rocks, when you start landing on those is that a regular 8-inch pneumatic tail wheel will just plow and fur clear up to the axle. So when you start, that's one of the things when you start getting anything soft is the tail wheel. And you guys know, I don't know if anybody has an STC or a bigger tail wheel for the Stinsons, but that's one of the things. One of the little sayings about Alaska landing off field and stuff is that they say if it looks rough, it is. If it looks smooth, it might be. And the other one goes that if you're, and this is so true. I mean, I learned this my first trip up there landing off field. So you fly over it and you look down there and it looks like gravel, it's rocks. Okay? You fly over and look down there and you think, it looks kind of rocky. They're boulders. We landed on the bottom end of a glacier. The glaciers at the bottom end have a deal called a moraine or a moraine. I don't know, I'll mispronounce it. But, you know, a glacier is just the world's biggest bulldozer. And as they recede back, well, then this area down below is just like a rock quarry scattered with rocks and gravel. And so we landed in a moraine down below a glacier my first trip up there. And I thought there was brush about this tall. There was some smoke because of forest fire and stuff. And the brush scraped the bottom side of my wings, and it took, I don't know, better than a day to clear a place to take off. I never was so glad to be down and safe in my life because, you know, when I flaring and that stuff started coming up in my windows, you know, by then it was too late and and it was a one-way area. I was landing into some trees or at least taller terrain and bushes that once you finally committed to land, you were there. And in off-airport stuff, and any stuff actually, that's the hardest thing for me to do is to land into an area you can't go around. You can take an area that's twice what you can land in every time and land into something where you can't go around, and it's a big pucker factor, you know, because, I don't know, it looks shorter. Just because you can go out here and demonstrate, you know, landing, and you just take the number, you know. If you say you can go out here and demonstrate landing at 500 feet with your Stinson or whatever and stuff, go out there and land when at 1,000 feet there's big trees or rising terrain or something like that, and that really makes it hard. So in my case, you know, at that time I was landing in a deal that was 300 or 400 feet, you know, and that was great. I can do 300 or 400 feet, but boy, I'm telling you what, that looks really short about the time you're pulling back hard on a flare, and with me, I guarantee you that means I'm going to do a arrival instead of a landing because, you know, I'm so worried about the speed and everything like that. I'm going to be too slow and bang it in. But luckily, my airplane, like you guys' airplane, can seem to take a fair amount of punishment. So,
what's your notion on wheel landings versus 3-point, and then in particularly if you have a strong crosswind?
Well, strong crosswind, I'm going to about always wheel land it. I'm sorry. Just because it's easier for me to set up the track of the runway, get a wing low, and then go. And if I'm going to 3-point it, that means I'm crabbing down the runway and get it straightened out at the last minute and land. And so if you got, so many times when there's a crosswind, that means you also got a lot of gust and stuff. So if you're doing the 3-point attitude deal and about the time you think it's time to straighten up and land, you hit a gust, well, then you're blown off to the side, and it's just so much better to be able to track the runway, put it down, and then handle the, and then plus at the touchdown, then you still got way more tail authority. When you're down at 3-pointing it, you're slowed down, and the tail's not as doesn't have the authority and stuff. So I'm about always that way, you know. And I prefer that anyway, you know. If I'm landing anywhere I don't know, my airplane doesn't have very good visibility over the nose. So the only time, even on off airport landings, that I do a total 3-point stall landing is if it's just that short or I have to. You know, I prefer to do what I call a tail low landing, come in, touch the tail down, and then stick forward and bring the tail up so I can see what's going on. I've got real efficient brakes, and I can just hold the tail up and come down to slow and be done with it.
Do you practice around here, like landing in people's pastures? And,
Well, I don't call it practice. I just have fun that way, you know. And so I land in people's backyards and pastures and pasture roads. I have a blast out in the Flint Hills. You know, the area between here and my home is in the springtime, a year that they burned it off and things are greening back up. Well, then I just scavenger hunt, you know, fly around and see an old homestead and land and walk around it a little bit. I'm fortunate. I have a truck repair business, and so a tremendous number of these people, I've done some work on the truck or equipment, and I don't know all the landowners. I don't know all the land managers. I pretty well know where I shouldn't be, where I'm going to get a really big chewing, you know. But the other part of it is wait a minute, you know if there's anybody around, right? Before you ever land, because you get to see forever. So I don't know. I've got a real kick out of landing at these old homesteads and dugout houses and stuff, you know, and found pieces of old wood stoves. A place, I don't know, 2/3 of the way between here and Emporia. I lit to pick up a deer antler, and as I was walking back up the hill, I see a well that I almost stepped in, and it's like, wow, what's going on here? And I get to looking around, and there was you could see the depressions of a dugout house. And even looking around later, going back to that place, I've noticed where you can see at the bottom of the draw, and it's not a very big draw, where they broke the ground to get the sod. And there laid all the metal hoops of a wagon wheel, just like it probably found 100 years ago, you know. You look at or found an old axe head, you know, from an old forged axe where they actually folded two halves together, and just all kinds of neat stuff. So that's a lot of fun to me, you know.
Have you done any of the dead stick takeoffs like we see on YouTube?
No, Steve is one talented pilot. I wish I was as good as Steve, but
Everybody's seen that video, haven't you?
So there's a guy with a Just Highlander that lives off out in Utah, Steve Henry, and Steve is a nice guy and a horrendous pilot. And the Just aircraft has a 912 on it usually, and he lands up there on the side of a really steep, low mountain. You know, it's not rock. It is rocky, but I mean it's basically a grass. And then turns the airplane around, shuts the engine off, and coasts downhill, and then takes off, flies around a little bit, and lands on a gravel bar, sandbar down on the river.
But the part that
miles
you
per
missed,
hour.
after he goes off the cliff, he puts the nose down like that.
You know, have you guys ever went up and practiced doing a maximum climb out, do this at altitude, and then just totally yank the power? And what you'll see is that you got to point that nose at the ground. I mean, you just look at this deal and think, I'm going straight down in order to get airspeed pretty quick to where you'll be able to fly. And it's actually a pretty valuable lesson because it'll teach you that, like you see these guys in the STOL competitions that are showing off and doing this climb out, they lose power. They're going to be shy a couple hundred feet of what it needs to flare. And so that's why it's a good lesson to go out there, do a maximum climb out, and then pull the power and see what it takes you to recover. Note your altitude, your altimeter before and after. And he's the same way. When he does that takeoff, I mean, he's going down a 45-degree slope, and at the end of that, it must be, I don't know, almost a cliff, and he just dives that airplane off. And when I see that, I think, whoa, that had to look scary, didn't it?
So at a recent STOL competition, there was a guy that
stalled it just as he was trying to land. And he claimed that he was not properly using the rudder. He was correcting with aileron instead of rudder. Can you talk to that point?
So when you watch those guys, especially the ones that put leading edge slats on and fly in a real high angle of attack, then they start controlling the airplane there at the end really with rudder, not much aileron. And of course, if you think about it, and of course you guys are spoiled. You got the slots on the Stinson and it doesn't have that terrible much problem with that. You got a nice big tail and a nice big fuselage that try and keeps it straight. So, but you take those airplanes, the Cubs, and that they're modifying like this, and that was what was going on with that airplane too. It had slats. So in a high angle attack and the thing starts to roll to one side, well, when you put opposite aileron into that, it just puts that down aileron on the wing that already started to drop, and it's so slow it's not getting a lot of lift anyway. It added more drag than it added lift. And so that gets to be a real problem. I do not practice flying my airplane on the landings where those guys come in and hit that tail and the mains are up in the air 3 feet and plop it in. It doesn't have any practical use. You know what I'm saying? It's a kind of a showstopper deal, and it's a really good deal like that, but I'm going to leave the show-stopping stuff for Sean Tucker or somebody like that. I'm not going to do that. And then, I see most of you are gray-haired in here like me, and we kind of change our tune down the road. I was at Oshkosh one year and was listening to Bob Hoover talk about meeting Sean Tucker. And he said, "Sean, I'd like to be your friend, but I can't." And Sean at that time was doing a maneuver where he'd fly his airplane knife edge down the runway at just a few feet. And of course, Bob Hoover commands the respect of everybody, has earned the respect of everybody. And he told Sean, he said, "If you keep doing that maneuver, you're going to be dead." And he said, "I've lost too many friends." And he says, "I'm not going to be your friend and then have to go to your funeral." And Sean Tucker quit that maneuver. Well, we're all that way, you know what I'm saying? And so people are looking at us, young pilots that are just started out, or old pilots that have just started out, or people that look at us and say, "Well, I've got that," they look at me and say, "Well, Doug's got a lot of experience." And I always chuckle at that because I always think of myself as being, just a step or two behind most people, And you have to think about it and say, well, what kind of example am I setting? Because that's what's going to happen. And don't attribute this to me, but that's what I think about those guys doing this really maximum climb out at Oshkosh in that STOL competition. It's like, no, take off, then build some speed and get this thing up to where you got a little bit of safety factor. I mean, when you're flying off that ultralight field at Oshkosh, you don't have anywhere to go anyway. And you're going to have to get a pretty aggressive takeoff, but not like those guys are doing, because like I said, if you lose power in that situation, for whatever reason, one of the things that happened here a few years ago, 2 years ago at Talkeetna, they were having a STOL competition, and somebody dreamed up the idea that because everybody's getting these leading edge slats and doing all this extra stuff, that they would have a slow flying competition. And so those guys were supposed to fly at 100 feet and go as slow as they could, and then they'd take a radar gun and see who was the slowest. And about the second guy there in one of the custom built Cubs with the leading edge slats and all this kind of stuff, did just the exact same thing. The thing started to quit flying. He tried to collect it with aileron, and bang, he come in and, tore up a $200,000 airplane. Luckily, he walked away, but that's just dumb. Think about it. See how slow you can fly at 100 feet? It works good till it doesn't.
You ever had any trouble with a big tire?
Yeah, I was just in New Mexico. I have a good friend there, and New Mexico Pilots Association, by the way, is a great organization. I had a fun time. They got a lot of strips that they run around and are maintaining, and that's kind of loosely used, maintaining, but making available to the general public on BLM land and National Forest land in New Mexico, and they're doing a great job of it. And a lot of these strips, of course, they're high altitude, but they're long, and in other words, they're not made for airplanes like me. So I've always had people say, "Well, don't you feel that tire when you touch down have to spin it up?" I'm like, "Well, no, I guess I don't," And they said, "Well, other airplanes do, or other guys do," and I always thought, Well, you get out there, we had a lot of 10,000 foot density altitude, So what's my actual ground speed compared to back here? And so I decided I hate those tires on pavement at 10,000 feet density altitude because it's a real jump spinning those tires up. So I had 26-inch bush wheels on first, and when I quit going to Alaska, which is probably getting into the foreseeable future, I'll put those back on. There's really no need for the 31s unless you're getting off into real rough stuff. But there's no comparison between the 31s and the 26s when you start landing on, volleyball rocks and stuff like that. I'll let the tires down to about 3 pounds, and that really gives them a tremendous amount of cushion on that rough stuff. Hurts you on the takeoff, and so if I get really pushed on takeoff, like when we're hauling out game and hunters and stuff, and stuff, well, by that time we've moved all the biggest rocks, I can show you pictures of times that we've got rocks lined up for 400 feet along a gravel bar, where we kept rolling off the big rocks and rolling off the big rocks. And every time you walk it, you think, oh my goodness, how did you miss that one, and throw off another one and throw off another one. So then I'll air it back up. I just have a real lightweight bicycle pump. Takes a little bit of time, but I'm going to Alaska in a little 2-place airplane. So everybody says, why don't you carry an electric one? It's like, well, because I got one made out of a bicycle that weighs 13 ounces, and that other one weighs 2 pounds, and I don't have 2 pounds to spare. I'd love to, something like a Stinson would be a lot better airplane to travel that distance. So I'll air the tires back up to 6, 7, 8 pounds for that, because now I've cleaned the rough stuff off and I want to get off faster, and it makes a lot of difference when they're soft, the rolling resistance in them.
Any more questions?
Yeah, you guys are finding out that me and a politician have something in common, aren't you? Yeah, what that is if I speak more than 5 minutes, I repeat myself. That's kind of the way the politicians are, too.
We appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
You guys, like I said, if I can, one of the things that would just thrill me to death, if somebody said, hey, I want to fly to Alaska and I can inspire them. I brought a couple little photo books here, and you can go to, and my daughter does this for me with my help, you can go to a couple of internet sites, Shutterfly and Snapfish, and make these little books. And what got these started with me is my sister, one of the things, my sister did genealogy and came up with a story about some great or great-great-grandparents that lived in Illinois, went to St. Joe, Missouri every year with a team of oxen and hauled people to Oregon on the Oregon Trail. That was in this great-great-granddad's obituary. That's all I know. You know what I would give for a story of that? And so I thought about that more. Actually, both my grandfathers died by the time I was 30 days old. I don't have any grandfather stories other than the very few passed down. And I can't change that, but I can change it and go into the future. And if you look at these books, they're nothing fancy. I'm not going to get any prizes for it, anything like that. But they're inexpensive to make, and it'll be different than a bunch of pictures sitting in a drawer somewhere. My sister dug out all the old family pictures, and we're like, well, who's that? Well, is that Uncle so-and-so? And we don't know. And so this is just a little window for my great-grandkids to look at and say, wow, who was that guy? And you all have those stories, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's just a story about your first house or raising kids when they were young. You all have those stories, and this is an easy way to do it. This book won't be thrown into a bin of pictures somewhere. It'll always be sitting on a coffee table or on a bookshelf, and it'll reappear, 100 years from now. And I make more than one, and once you do an account on that deal, you can go back and buy more copies. So I make a copy for all my kids and all my grandkids and any friend that I think that's not so bored with my tales that he'd like to look at it and stuff. And so, it's a lot of fun to do, and it's a lot of fun to have it there. The one he has here, Ken has, is my last trip was in 2014. And in 2014, if you guys are familiar with Alaska at all, Fairbanks is kind of in the center of the state. It's in what they call, the interior. And it's kind of about where you can drive, really. I mean, you can drive to Fairbanks and go down to Anchorage, and you can go up the Hall Road to the north, but you can't hardly drive west of Fairbanks. And we flew and hunted 469.9 miles with my GPS west of Fairbanks. So that's 400 miles off the road system. That was interesting and fun. One of the things I learned flying back and forth to Alaska was that most of the airports, big airports, a lot of the big airports in Western Canada and a lot of them that are in the middle of nowhere in Alaska that are hubs were built by the U.S. During World War II to take aircraft over to Russia through the Lend-Lease program. I just, like everybody in school, I learned enough to pass the test, and the Lend-Lease program was what Roosevelt set up to give a bunch of equipment to the Allied forces right before we got into the war. I just thought the Allied was the French. I mean, I knew there was the French, the English, but I knew there was some interconnection with Russia and stuff, but I didn't realize the amount of stuff we took to Russia. And so one of the airports I always stop at is Swift Current, Saskatchewan, and of course, the military fields, most of the time, if they have the room, are those great big triangle shape with 3 different runways. And at Swift Current, they got this humongous, almost city block sized wooden hangar that they built during those years and stuff. And I ran into that out at places like McGrath, Alaska, which is 300 miles from anything, same thing. Now that keeps getting used, but I have to wonder how much of that world would have been opened up to aircraft and aviation if it hadn't been for what the government did in World War II to have infrastructure to support. You've all seen the signpost along the Alcan Highway of its 2,300 miles to Denver or whatever, and that's at Watson Lake. So in going up there, then I start reading these things about it because it's like, okay, well, Watson Lake, they only use one now, it's a 5,000 foot, but they did have to have a crosswind runway there too. And that was built at the first part of the war before the Alcan Highway was built. They took ships, brought the equipment in, jumped them off the ship down at Wrangell, Alaska, and the Wrangell Narrows, went up the Sakine River, pulling this stuff on a sled behind a D9 on the ice, and then run out of the river and went overland to Watson Lake and across the lake from the little Indian village at the time and built this runway. That's 300 miles. They drug stuff behind a D8 300 miles and built a runway before the highway was in. There's just so many stories like that. It's like, wow. In this one book I tell about this last trip, I was trying to get back, and that trip I was terribly plagued with weather the whole time. It took me 7 or 8 days to get to Alaska. It took me that long to get home. I got stuck in Fairbanks. I got stuck in Russian Mission. So I was trying to get back to Fairbanks and had bought fuel at one of the few places out there to get fuel, a little place called Antioch, Alaska. And you can save $1 a gallon by calling the Baptist Lay minister up, a guy named Bill Wilson. He comes out in his old beat-up Ford pickup, sells you 100 low lead for $11.60 a gallon. Yeah, it hurts. So we bought fuel. We overnighted there. We bought fuel, loaded up. When the weather finally got good, there's no radar weather once you, like even in Canada, there's satellite weather, but there's no radar weather. It's all ground reported and stuff like that. So you don't get as much information we get here. So I headed out of Antioch for McGrath, not quite 200 miles, made it about 120 miles, and the clouds and the low mountains intersected and turned around and come back. Called Bill up, had him fuel me up again, and waited till there was enough time to go out and try it again that evening, and if it didn't work, I'd still be able to come back. And I get about 80 miles from McGrath, and same old problem, and I thought, man, I hate to go back there and buy, and I'm looking around, there's like, there is nothing here to land on, and I hit my GPS for closest airports, and it came up Flat, Alaska. And so it's like, I turn over to the AOPA direct report on my GPS, and I just got a Garmin 495 and get to reading that, and it says, runway length and 2-foot tall vegetation and mud, unmaintained, and numerous windsock poles, no windsock on the north side of the runway. Well, it was 25 miles away, and I thought, I'm going to try this, So I made it to there, came in and landed, and I was just, wow. Matter of fact, I fell in love with Flat Alaska. What Flat Alaska is in 1908, two guys were prospecting and hit the mother lode. Ended up being the sixth largest gold strike in Alaska history. In the next 10 years, there got to be 6,000 people there. Now, this is 300 miles from anything, and it takes better than 1,500 miles of traveling down the river and back up another river to get there when they're bringing in mining equipment and stuff like that. And by the 19-teens, it was the largest city in Alaska, except it never was a city. Everybody rolled in there. But by World War, and the reason that book's called Luckier and Wiley Post is Wiley Post, everybody knows who Wiley Post is. If you're not an aviator, nobody knows who Wiley Post is, you know. Arguably the most famous celebrity in the world there in the early part of the 30s because of, well, these round-the-world flights. And today, nobody knows anything about him. His funeral was the largest private funeral in Oklahoma State history. And so, but anyway, he crash-landed there in 1933 on his round-the-world flight deal and stuff. So anyway, by the time World War II came, there was still a lot of gold mining going on there, but it had become mechanized by major players in the deal, and the little miner with a sluice block was long gone. Well, World War II had this deal called the Essential War Act or something, and if what you were doing wasn't deemed necessary for the war effort, you didn't get things like fuel, and so in other words, it ceased. So those people all packed up and left Flat Alaska, and by this time it's probably just a few hundred, in the spring of 42, thinking, well, we'll be back here by the spring of 43, and for the most part, it never came back. Some stuff went on in the 60s and stuff, and there's houses with the curtains still on it, and a city hall with a player piano sitting in it, and old trucks that look to me like if you'd air the tires up and put some gas in it, you could drive away. So anyway, it was just a neat deal that I happened to undo by accident, and so now I guess I'll spend the rest of my life dreaming like, I'm going to figure out how to go back to Flat Alaska. So if you're interested, look it up, and I show a few pictures in that book that talk about it and stuff. So, you know, we're lucky, you know, you guys and I, if you get to looking at the number of active pilots, you know, why you get to figuring this deal up, why we're less than 1/5 to 1% of the population. It's a shame, you know, because how do we change that? You know, in my local airport, we formed a flying club and tried real hard to change that, but instructors are just like hen's teeth anymore, you know. You get an instructor there, and as soon as they get, that's a younger guy, as soon as they get some hours, why, they're off flying somewhere commercially, and for whatever reason, most of the older guys that are instructors are kind of scared of liability or just don't want to take on primary students. It's going to be hard for this generation to learn to fly. And I don't know how we change that, you know. Hopefully somebody will figure that out and change it. And I guess if you get bit hard enough, like probably most of us did, why, you'll figure out how. So.
Doug, a few of us here are reasonably new tailwheel pilots. Is there common mistakes that you see? What if whatever you do, don't do this?
No, I can't tell you on that. You know, on some airplanes, it's don't nose it over with the brakes. You know, I suspicion the Stinson has a fair amount of tail weight.
Yeah.
And so it's probably not too bad that direction and stuff. You know, and you know, the thing about a tail dragger is it flies the same way. You know, one of the things that when I was instructing the people in the Cub that I figured out real quick, that I got to tell them when they landed, keep it straight with the brakes, because they could do that so much faster. They could learn that so much faster than trying to do it all with the rudder. And of course the Cub had heel brakes, and I'm like, nope, as soon as you touch this thing down, well, you just keep it going straight down the runway with the brakes, and then as you learn a little bit, you can transfer into where, wait a minute, you're never using the brakes until you need them because something happened wrong. And then I guess the other thing is that, and I'm sure you guys all know this because, well, you know, airplanes were originally made to fly off grass. And you can get by with a whole lot more in a tailwheel airplane in way of mess-ups on grass than you ever can on pavement. So it's so different because if you learn to fly in a Cherokee or a Cessna, and especially if it was a young instructor, you probably never landed on grass. We got a guy at home that flies a lot in his RV-8. He's never been on grass, not when he was taking his lessons in a Cessna, not in his RV-8. It's just like, wow, well, they're missing out on all the fun. But on a tailwheel airplane, if I'm going cross country and have an opportunity to use a grass runway, I will. One of the things I don't do, just because I've almost been bit a couple times, is that at my home airport, I keep my airplane at home, but at a home airport there in Emporia, and the airport's close by that I'm to all the time, I know where I can land in the infield at, or alongside the runway. In my home airport, they mow 20 feet beside the runway lights, and so I just land there all the time. I don't do that on cross countries because you don't know what's out there. And I got lucky, it only cost me a flat tail wheel, but I decided, you know what? I don't do that. I use the main runway and be on pavement, but I love grass, and tail draggers love grass.
Any other questions, Jack?
I got a question. When you typically go to Alaska, what kind of length of time do you generally plan on? Do you say it's going to take 2 weeks, 1 week, or?
So most of the time you could say that your trip up and back, your traveling time each way would be 5 days, and that gives you a day. It gives you a day and a half easily for weather, and most of the time that'll catch it. Especially if you're going to go in the middle of the summer, which the time to go is late June up until about August. And then it just depends on how much time you want to be in the state. One of the things about Alaska is it's so big, you don't get to see it in one trip, and you don't get to see it in 4 or 5. Just pick what you want to see and hit the high points and do a little research. And to me, it's always aviation oriented. In other words, I have as much fun walking the ramp at Fairbanks and seeing, oh, wait a minute, there's 100 and some airplanes sitting here on the ramp, and oh, that doesn't count the 100 and some airplanes that are all around the float plane ditch. And so that's more to me about it and stuff. So, and it's not hard. You do need to start planning in advance because you gotta get a sticker from Homeland Security that used to be you could buy the sticker at the border. Now you have to apply and get that. You have to set up an account on the Custom Border Protection site, and it's called EAFIS, and it's just electronic flight following. You have to file an EAFIS to go in across the border and stuff. It's like every government website, it's convoluted and stuff, like I tried one time to put in an airport that it was going to be my airport I exit from, which was the actual grass strip on the runway at Scobie, Nebraska, or Scobie, Montana. Scobie, Montana is just about North Dakota and right on the U.S.-Canadian border. And I worked and couldn't get that to work. And it needed a K in front of the abbreviator, even though it was number, letter, number. And, that's not the way it normally is. Another thing about Alaska is, too, Alaska uses different identifiers than's in your GPS. It's an international identifier, and it'll almost always start with a P, and your GPS will have the other in it. I don't know why Grumman doesn't change the database or something, so it gets a little confusing there. But the trip across the border is not a big deal, but start it in advance. You cannot fly across the border without a passport. You can't do it off a driver's license. When I first started going up, 2 means of identification, that worked. Now you got to have a passport, And then, like I said, the EAFIS is really not hard to do. It's just getting used to the government way of doing things. You do have to have a valid medical, yeah. Because for whatever reason, Customs Border Protection now has made it a practice. And they didn't used to do this because they're not the FAA, right? But now they have made it a practice to ask you for your pilot's license and your medical and your aircraft registration. So I don't know why they decided that was in the national interest of the national security, but they have. So.
Do you know if they accept basic med for that, or do you have to have a third class?
Currently, basic med is not accepted. I'm watching this real close because I'm having medical problems like so many people, and the AOPA who really was the big pusher for the basic med, is working really hard to try and get Canada accept the basic med. There's two hurdles. One is Canada, and two is that it's actually governed by some pact, the international something or other pact on international flying. In other words, it's not just the U.S. and Canada. Canada has a deal similar to basic med they call the first class medical, and so it's really more lenient than our basic med in some ways anyway. So there's no good reason they don't accept it. They just don't yet. So hopefully that'll change. I don't know. My friends in New Mexico said that Jack Pelton gave a talk down there to their EA chapter after the AOPA get together here a couple of weeks ago in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he says the EAA is pushing to up the light sport deal to airplanes that would include more than your Stinson. So basically you'd be back to the deal they always talked about, a driver's license medical. So, but yeah, Canada requires you have a medical across the border. Nobody in Canada ever asks you for that. When you start reading the AOPA site, or whoever's on flying to Alaska or flying into Canada, they're going to tell you that you're supposed to have a radio license. And a lot of you guys here have been flying since you had a radio license, but any of you, can you find your radio license? Nobody ever asked you for the radio license. Nobody cares. It's one of those regulations that they don't enforce. And so don't spend $175 on a radio license just because you're flying to Alaska, because nobody's going to ask you. Nobody's going to need it. You hear these stories about the amount of survival equipment you're supposed to keep in there. It's no longer a law. It might be a recommendation. I go up there with enough stuff to where I'm going to be fine as far as, because I rarely get a motel. I pilot lounges or a tent. I don't want to go to a motel and then have to worry about my airplane. I got to get a taxi to go to a motel and then get a taxi to come back. And then I'm in a strange airport, so I don't know what those people are like as far as, local people causing problems or anything like that. And so I don't get a motel. I just stay there with my airplane stuff. And the other thing that I do, which is really neat, and if you guys don't do this and you're doing a lot of cross countries, you might think about it. There's a couple of different ones now. The one I started with was originally called a Spot. It's a little orange box like this. It's got a $120 a year subscription fee, and every 10 minutes it puts out a ping that goes to the satellite. It goes back to this Spot place, and I can give you a link to my Spot page, and you can follow me all the way to Alaska. And also it has an emergency deal like your ELT, except this is strictly through it, which is the OnStar network, and you can hit that for search and rescue. The other thing is that when you're flying up that far in that, and because you're flying over a lot of country that's nothing there, the Yukon Territory is as big as Kansas, Nebraska, and maybe throw in some of Oklahoma. And there's 30,000 people in the whole territory. 20,000 live in the capital, Whitehorse. There's a lot of nothing. And so go ahead and get the 406 ELT. Have a better ELT so there's a better chance of looking for you and stuff. We're all going to have it someday anyway, and so I just updated to the 406 so that you can do it. If you don't do that, then buy one of the personal beacons that you can buy from Cabela's and all the sporting goods stores, and it gets registered with NOAA Search and Rescue just like your regular ELT does, and so that gives you a way to beam. Now the Spot's been updated now to and another company, InReach, which just got bought out by Grumman in this last year, and it's the same deal, a little bit more expensive, and you have the ability to do text messaging via satellite. In other words, you don't need cell phone. When you get to Alaska and Canada, your cell phone's going to work very little because they're going to have different carriers anywhere besides the big city in Alaska. Then they're going to like your Verizon or whoever you got. When you go through Canada, you're going to have to ask your carrier to open Canada up. Most of your regular phone services don't have Canada. And when you're around a decent sized city, your cell phone's going to work. But if you're not around a decent sized city, then they're going to either be no cell phone service, or you'll find out that it's some little carrier that doesn't share towers and forth back and forth. We've went to, and this is so popular, people that fly in Alaska, I have no idea the percentage, but the majority have a satellite phone anymore. And you can rent a satellite phone. We rent it for 30 days and buy just about the minimum amount of time, and then you can add time if you need to. And what that ends up being really nice is that when you need to call flight service and you're somewhere you don't have cell phone service, that just works really nice. So adds $200 to the trip. That's about what we spent. You know, we rent it from an outfit. I just get on the internet and find the cheapest. The last time I rented it from an outfit in Florida. They FedEx it to you a couple of days before you leave, and you FedEx it back. And it's, like I said, yeah, it's a couple $100, but you know what? When you're in the middle of nowhere and the wife wants you to call, why, you just pick up the phone and call. There is a downside of the Spot satellite messenger. So when I go to Alaska, a lot of people want to fly to Alaska, and I got a lot of hunting friends and stuff, and so I'll give them the link so they can watch me. And so you can, when you get on that link, you can go to Google Earth and see. In other words, if I had my Spot turned on now, it's on my airplane. Why, somebody could go to that site, go to Google Earth, and have a picture of Beaumont, right? So we were flying up the Alcan there, trying to just flying along in some low ceiling weather and light rains, and I knew the dew point was about the same as the pass when I'd got a weather briefing that morning out of Watson Lake, and the dew point, or the freezing point, was 4,200 feet, and the pass is about 4,000, 4,200. So we got coming up close to that pass, and we'd been flying low, but we had 10-mile visibility. Come up that pass, and the little rain showers turned into pretty hard snow. So I have a real, I don't do ice, snow, I'm done, right? So I just made a U-turn and thinking, oh, you know, I'm looking down, and there was a little roadhouse. I've been picking out landing spots along the Alcan the whole way. You know, just when I get in bad weather, I do that. And so I saw this little roadhouse before we went by it, and I just turned around and come back. A car went by, and I just boomed down, landed, pulled off into their parking lot. Roadhouse is just a little gas station restaurant. There's a few of them along the highway. Back in the days of the North Slope oil boom, the pipeline boom, there were just dozens and dozens, but most of those are just rolled up ghost town deals now. So I landed there, and we went in and had breakfast and stuff, and I'm always in the habit of turning my Spot off because it just runs with 4 AAA batteries, which it'll last a week. You know, I mean, I put new batteries before I come home, but I mean, they last a long time with the good batteries. But I turned it off, and my wife works at my business too, and about 2 hours later, she said the phone started ringing at the business. I put this all together after I got home, and people would say, well, we don't want to scare you, but they've been on a gravel bar in the middle of the Yard River for 2 hours and hadn't moved, because it only hits every 10 minutes, right? And the last time it hit, I had moved out. The road went up into a little bit higher hill company, and I'd been following the river instead of the road, and it showed me on that gravel bar, and they said, we don't want to worry you, but they're on a gravel bar and hadn't moved for 2 hours, so there are some downsides. I've learned a little bit to leave it turned on for a little while after I come somewhere or something. So.
Now, last question, and we probably better move on, but do they mark the highways or roads up there where it's suitable for landing?
No. There's a big debate as to whether or not it's still legal to land on the road. Okay. I've lived on the road in Canada. Nobody's ever cared. Alaska, whether it's legal or not, people do it, and so you're not going to have any problem. So road landings are just like everything else, so you got to try and anticipate the problems. Most of the way up and down the Alcan Highway, wires aren't a problem because, well, if there's a settlement, a town like Toad River, there's only, 30 or 40 people there. They have a big generator that takes care of those 30 or 40 houses. So if there's a high line, it just goes right across there in town. And so same way with towers, they don't build towers out in Western Canada because they just put them on the side of a mountain. Instead of it being a several 100-foot tower, it's a 50-foot tower on the side of a mountain. Why build a big tower when there's a mountain there and stuff? So, yeah. And in Canada, you're required to file a flight plan too. And once you fly over that country, you realize that's a good deal. Because I've hit a headwind and been, I'm now more conservative on my time. In other words, if I think I'm going to make it in 2 hours, I tell them 3 or 3.5 or something. So, but anyway, I hit a headwind and was 30 minutes overdue, and they have these little relay towers along the way, just like our relay towers, and Canada has an in-flight monitoring frequency that you're supposed to monitor in flight, 1267. And I'm sitting there flying along there and pretty quick on 1267 while they're saying 5-4 Whiskey Echo, are you out there? Like, who's calling me? And yeah, it was the Canadian Flight Service said, you're over on your flight plan and we're worried about you. You know, I like that a lot.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
When you file those flight plans in Canada, do you get charged by NAV Canada?
NAV Canada does charge you. I was all worried about that and stuff. And when you enter the state, they ask you how much your airplane weighs, and they want to know how many kilos it weighs, you know, or kilograms or whatever. And I don't know how much mine weighs, so the bottom one's 750, and I know it's basically, if you double that, that's the pounds, real roughly. So I just tell them mine's 750, and I've never got a bill for more than $20. And they bill you when you come home. You know, I mean, it's a month or two later. So yeah, you do get billed for that, and it's insignificant in the cost of the trip.
Sound like we all need to try to plan a trip to Alaska, huh?
You know, the 170 Association here a long time ago did their annual meeting at Fairbanks. It'd probably be a great deal. And I'm sure you'll find, because it's a popular airplane. Because a lot of the flying up there is not necessarily bush flying. And then, like I told you too, you know, on some of the rivers, grapple bars are just really long. But so many people use it for some type of a transportation. So Stinson's a great airplane for that.
Great. Doug, thank you.